against bigotry.
This has been an exhausting emotional week, I think, for most of us. It's been following the news because we know that we are living in an increasingly divided nation. And animosities are running high. In watching the Senate hearings on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh and the aftermath this week further heightened many of the tensions. And the whole ordeal did not do anyone any good, but has marred the reputations and good names and placed individuals at high risk, with death threats being made to the lives of Dr. Ford and the family of Judge Kavanaugh. Death threats and harassment. Guilt and innocence have been assigned to a court of public opinion with little corroborating evidence yet. And Americans were riveted to the screens as we watched two credible and convincing witnesses often offer diametrically opposed versions of a story that allegedly happened 36 years ago. And this has been politicized and become another point of tension in our attempt to have a civil society. And the truth is, I believe, minds have pretty much been made up long before the hearings ever occurred, and few are swayed by these inquiries. Now, what concerns me is the polarization and the hardening of the sides, and the very real temptation to demonize and name-call people who think differently than we do. There are families who cannot talk about these things in a rational way without it descending into an argument and creating a hostile environment right there around the dinner table. Internet has become a cesspool of opinions of a toxic nature. And we've reached new moral lows when a Congresswoman, Maxine Waters, can call for organized attacks and systematic harassment of Trump supporters and the shameful treatment of Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her family and Ted Cruz and their families just while attempting to have family dinners at a restaurant. And the rise that we have watched of radical groups like Antifa, white supremacists, Louis Farrakhan, and the Nation of Islam all indicate a serious breakdown in public discourse and civility. Racist tweets by Roseanne Barr cost her a television show, but it reveals lingering attitudes of racial hatred even in our enlightened, educated, and civilized culture. And the whole issue of taking the knee, sparked by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, elicited a rise of nationalistic jingoism and bigotry in religious, racial, nationalistic, and political manifestations is on the rise. And this virulent bigotry blights our country and makes sane, sober, and well-reasoned judgment most difficult. Craziness rules, and people are getting stirred up into a frenzy of hate. What is bigotry exactly? Bigotry can be defined as an intolerance toward those who hold different opinions from oneself. Intolerance towards those who hold a different opinion from oneself. Some of the synonyms for bigotry are dogmatism, illiberalism, illiberality, illiberalness, intolerance, intolerantness, narrow-mindedness, opinionatedness, partisanship, sectarianism, small-mindedness. Do any of these words ring true to you as you listen to or watch or read the news these days? Is this happening? Can you discern bigotry as a mark of public discourse going on these days? I can. On my journey to become a Methodist, I wasn't born, I was born actually into a Methodist home until I was 6 years old, but most of my spiritual sojourn in my teenage and young adult years was as a Pentecostal. But when I moved up to New Jersey, I joined ranks with the Methodist Church. I was going to Presbyterian Seminary, which is Princeton Theological Seminary, and I wanted to check out the Methodist Church. So I had to take Methodist history and doctrine as well as Methodist polity. In fact, some of you know Bob Williams. His wife is from this church. He was my teacher in the Methodist polity. I wanted to know what I was getting into. I was escaping a church that had become, in my mind, very cultic in nature, a personality cult of the leader. And in the Methodist history course, the professor required that students read 10 of Wesley's 44 standard sermons. Wesley equipped his circuit riders, who did not have theological education as much as I've had, but they equipped them with standard sermons that were printed out for them to read and say, this is the kind of things that we can help develop our thought. And one of them, and during my reading, I was choosing from those sermons. One of them that particularly caught my attention was a sermon that Wesley wrote called A Caution Against Bigotry. That's what I named this sermon. You see, Wesley, that was an Anglican priest 250 plus years ago, was sick and tired of religious and political intolerance, which he labeled bigotry. It's not a new phenomenon because bigotry plagued Europe for hundreds of years, and over 250 years ago in Wesley's day, it was still going on. And Wesley was trying through his sermons. I've got 171 of his sermons published that I have downstairs in my office. He tried through his sermons to address the current issues of his day, and religious bigotry loomed large in his mind as a work of the devil that should be challenged, resisted, and as Christians be defeated. The scriptural reference for that sermon, A Caution Against Bigotry, was the same as the one that Deanna read this morning from the Gospel of Mark. I'm going to read just the salient verses again. John, the youngest of the disciples, said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone throwing demons out in your name, and we tried to stop him because he wasn't following us." But Jesus replied, "Don't stop him. No one does powerful acts in my name can quickly turn around and curse me. Whoever isn't against us is for us." Wesley used this same text to go after the sin of bigotry. And in the sermon, he defined bigotry this way. Quote, "It is too strong an attachment to or fondness for our own party, opinion, church, and religion. Therefore, he is a bigot who is so fond of any of these, so strongly attached to them, as to forbid any who casts out devils because he differs from himself in any or all of these particulars." Unquote. Wesley saw the error and confusion that religious partisanship unleashed upon the world had brought a discredit to the name of Christ and the purposes of God. He explained, what is casting out devil? He had a whole section on it. What is it, casting out devil? As the work of anyone who opposes the kingdom of Satan and strives to liberate souls from the bondage to the evil one. Don't we pray, liberate us from evil in the Lord's Prayer? Deliver us from the evil one, it actually says in the Greek. In this world, there are children of light who submit to the reign of God, and God holds us in his hands. But many people still live in rebellion and revolt against God. They are unwittingly held fast in the clutches of the dark side, of Satan, and of the demonic. They do not seek to do God's will, but Satan's will. They are victims and captives led astray by greed and hate and lust and jealousy. They do evil things and hurt others, sometimes without any conscience about it. Their lives reflect not the love of God, but the lust of the flesh, the desires just to feel pleasure, and the pride of life. They wallow in pride, or the opposite is self-pity, to take themselves too seriously, and they pursue empty pleasures and engage in futile pursuits. Paul describes them that their spiritual minds are darkened. They have no hope and are without God in the world. They are Satan's prey. Satan, who goes about, it says in Peter, as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And they are ignorant of God and God's will. They sow to the flesh, and from the flesh reap corruption. But God's people find motivation through the Holy Spirit to save souls, to liberate people from Satan's clutches. God's people seek God's wisdom to know the mind of God and to seek the power to do it in this world. Because, brothers and sisters, we have a message of God's love revealed in the Christ. We possess a reason for our faith. And God has granted us a mission that is just brimming with hope. What do people need but faith, hope, and love? What is God like? How can I know this God? What difference will it make if I do know this God? The disciples of Jesus work to transform the world. I put a comic in my Facebook. Some of you may have already got it. They had a committee meeting with the pastor and said, we want to transform the world, but we really don't want to make any essential differences, changes, Let's just let everything go on the two bookends. We've never done it that way before. We've always done it this way. That stifle church life. The disciples of Jesus are a community called to work for the transformation of the world, which means the liberation of people who are enslaved to Satan so that they can be born anew as children of light and escape from Satan's jaws and brought back from death to life. And God works through us to do that. That's who we are. That's why we are. We're not a social club of people like us, exclusive and hoping that we don't grow too much. God is at work in the world in many ways, operating through many people. Let that sink in. Not just us, not just Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, and Lutherans. We can get sidetracked by our bigotry, but God works sometimes through people very different than us. They may also be doing the work of God, but don't follow with us. And that was John Wesley's point. There are many who are doing the work of trying to liberate souls from Satan's clutches. Bigotry narrows our focus and sets us against people that may in fact be doing the work of God. Martin Luther King Jr. was demonized, but he, I think, was doing the work of God. He wasn't very popular among some people for it, but now he's held as a saint. For centuries after the Reformation, tensions between the Roman Catholics and the Protestant Christianity erupted into mutual execrations, inquisitions, hostilities, persecutions, and even violent wars of religion. And this is what John Wesley was sick of in his day. It wasn't Christ motivating those conflicts. It was bigotry. And that's the reason John Wesley undertook to address the issue in his sermon, A Caution Against Bigotry. Sometimes we Christians can become very narrowly focused in our thinking, and we draw boundaries around us. And we get angry about the people that are outside those boundaries. Lord, we saw somebody doing something in your name and he wasn't with us, and so I forbid him. And Jesus said, don't forbid him. If he's not against us, he might just be for us. This Saturday, we're going to have the bishop here to talk about a way forward, which is a very contentious issue that boundaries have been drawn and people have become very narrow in their focus on the issue of homosexuality, gay marriage, gay clergy. The church is wrestling with that. And I'm glad that I'm in the Methodist Church because we keep these things on the front burner and we talk about them. We don't just try to solve it once and forever and make it go away. It's come to a very hostile time in which the bishop is going to explain what has been going on the last 2 years as the bishops have been meeting to try to give some guidance to our church. I think about the Taipei International Church. Right before I got there was another pastor that we talked to, and he said there was a time that they were having worship. And there was a young Chinese gal that could play the piano beautifully, and she was playing, but somebody caught a whiff that she wasn't a Christian. She was on her way to being one. She liked playing church music. She liked the Christians. But all of a sudden, it divided the church. They galvanized. Can we let this non-Christian come in and play in our worship team? All she was doing was playing the music. And the aftermath of that was more damaging than the fact is whether she was playing or not. It wasn't a very good witness to her. But I'm just saying, how did bigotry say she can do the work of God even before she names the name of Christ? If she's doing the work of God. Stephanie was trying when she worked with the Ida people, which was an indigenous tribe that lived up in the mountains, and they were far, far from getting an education. That was the problem. And Stephanie and her team opened up a school among the Ida people, but they needed to finance a teacher. And we went to one church and asked them, we've got a teacher, we just need a salary for her. It's not very much, it's in the Philippines. This teacher is willing to work with the Ida people way up in the mountains. When Stephanie was the real missionary when I was abroad. I mean, I went to a place, I had a nice office, I stayed in a nice place, and I taught seminary. But Stephanie, she had to get up and drive about 5 hours away from our home, get off-road, drive about 17 miles, 15 to 17 miles off-road on dirt roads, and then get off and walk 9 miles and cross a river 4 times to get where the Ida people were. The government didn't even know where they were, but Stephanie opened up a school there, and we had a teacher. But the question of the church was, is the teacher a Christian? I said, well, knowing who would be qualified and go up there, she's probably a Roman Catholic Christian. No, we really don't want to do that. But all they're wanting is a teacher to teach them. They have the church, they have the gospel. Do you see how the narrowing bigotry and the focus, we've got to have them being evangelical Christians just like us to teach a group of children reading and writing. And so the offer didn't go through. I think we would all know, if we know something about American history, that the unfortunate racial divide and segregation of white churches and black churches is what led Martin Luther King to say Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week. There was a church that I heard about in a book, and it's a very telling title called The Autopsy of a Deceased Church. That the church was failing in membership, it was small, and they started a praise band. And then there was contemporary music, and the congregation began to grow. And then they said, we need to split the services, and we will have the service, the early service will be the traditional service, and the other service will be the contemporary service. And the contemporary service was at first, the earlier service, and the later one. And they said, this church is growing, but all of the parents are saying we need to be free on Sunday afternoon. Can we have the service, it was hard to get the children. I forgot exactly how it was, but they wanted to flip it. And the church called into people who had served on the board but hadn't been to church in many years. They brought them in and they voted it down. They said, we don't want that kind of music in our church. And so the service stopped, the membership went down, and eventually the church closed. Bigotry. But Christians can also shine when we challenge our own bigotry and attempt to draw the circle wider and let our own hearts become as big as God's heart. I'm thinking of a pastor I spent the day with yesterday. We went bicycle riding with Tom and Carol Miller that's up at Bordentown. You know, they've opened up a wonderful ministry there of feeding people in the community who come. But you know who helps them? A local mosque helps cook the food, and the Muslims and the Christians are working together in a certain kind of unity. Now, you don't have to give up your faith. You don't have to insist that somebody else take on your faith. You witness for your faith by the way that you live your life and let your light shine before people to see your good works. But what about these other people who are willing to do some of the same good works for their understanding of the love of God? I told Tom yesterday I'm going to use your church in my sermon illustration today. I think it's a fantastic way of opening minds and hearts and bringing people together. John Wesley moved his sermon to a close with a prayer that would be good for us to adopt as our own when he said right near the end of the sermon, "Search me, O God, and prove me, and try my reins and my heart, and look well that there be any way of bigotry in me, and lead me in the way of life everlasting." And he added, to be most clear, his final sentences, "In order to examine ourselves thoroughly, let the case be proposed in the strongest manner." And he's using terms that meant a whole lot back in those days. He says, what if I were to see a papist, meaning a Roman Catholic committed to the Pope? What if I were to see a papist or an Arian, somebody who does not hold that Jesus is God, like the Jehovah's Witnesses? He says, what if I see the papist or an Arian or a Socinian, a doctrine that held a different view of how did Christ work for us? What if I were to see a Papist, an Arian, or Socinian casting out devils? If I did, I could not forbid even him without convicting myself of bigotry. Yea, and if I could be supposed that I would see a Jew, a deist, or a Turk, which is their term for Muslim, doing the same, were I to forbid him either directly or indirectly, I would be no better than a bigot. And John ended his sermon, John Wesley. He put it before the people that we don't really have to draw the boundaries to say who's in and who's out. God will do that. All we have to do is find out what's at the center. To love God and love neighbor. Let's do that with all of our mind and heart and soul and strength. And if anybody wants to join us, let them. And if anybody else is doing it, pray for them and bless them. Amen.
Amen.
Let's